All right. So welcome to today's session on the number trajectory. I'm going to introduce myself and give you kind of a background about what the session will include before we dive in. So for the agenda today, we're going to have a few norms in the beginning. I'll introduce who I am, and then we'll talk about what the number trajectory actually is, because it's not necessarily something that's pinpointed within the Eureka Math curriculum. Then we'll talk about some data collection, not as a must, but as a tool to help you as needed with some of your students that you may have concerns about, and then some instructional implications, how you can adjust your instruction to meet those student needs. So my name is Erin Kleinman. Nice to meet you all through Zoom. This is my 17th year in MCPS, and I am the staff development teacher currently at Snowden Farm Elementary School. This is my 4th year in that role, and we do not have a math content coach, so I also serve as the math content coach. Prior to that, I was the same thing at Goshen Elementary School, and then I was a classroom teacher for 11 years before that. I've taught only in the classroom 4th and 5th grade. However, I teach a PDO course, MA 92, on kindergarten through 2nd grade math. So I have done a lot of experience in terms of kindergarten through 2nd grade with both the math content coach position as well as in teaching that course. I love math. It's always been my favorite subject. And my biggest push is to teach kids to be mathematicians and to use reasoning and be math thinkers and problem solvers, more like puzzle solvers, as opposed to fluent with math facts or memorizing algorithms. While that is important, it's only one component of math. And so my passion here in my role as a coach is to encourage teachers and students to use the standards of mathematical practice to be math thinkers, not math doers. And I just love math puzzles. So that's what I try to do with the kids and have them view math as just a puzzle to solve. For Zoom today, and I know we've had lots of different experiences with Zoom, it says turn cameras on. I really don't mind if you don't. It is okay. It is your comfort level. I will not be upset. And then for muting, just to make sure, because we have a tight 45-minute session, if you could use the chat feature instead, that would be preferable. But at the end of the session, there may be time for just open mic if you have questions that you'd rather vocalize. And that's pretty much it. I think you know the rest of a Zoom norm situation, but hopefully this session is beneficial to you. That's my only goal. Our outcomes for today is going to be to start. We want to define what the number trajectory is and each component of it. There are 7 parts of it. And then articulate how the student learning of that can impact what we call number sense, because we say number sense a whole lot, but we don't always know exactly what that means. So this should help pinpoint that for you. And then look at some data collection tools and instructional shifts that may need to occur based on what you're noticing with your students. So we're going to start with what is the number trajectory. And this is the part that's on Nearpod. Before we do that, number sense it's truly a phrase that's thrown around a lot, right? Like if you think of many teachers, myself included in the past, when you say, what is this? Well, what is a student struggling with? Well, they just don't have number sense, right? It's something we say all the time. So number sense is just knowing how numbers work together and just having an intuition about numbers and how they relate to each other. It does develop gradually. It's not something a child is born with, but it's the amount of practice they get working with numbers and number concepts. They have to explore them, visualize them, relate them to each other's, and it's not traditional algorithms. So it's beyond that, and that's what the number trajectory will jump into. We are going to do a Nearpod matching activity. I'm going to put the link in the chat again. Here is the Nearpod. And I can't really tell who's in there because I know our first session participants are still in there as well. So that's why it looks like so many. And I'm going to type the code in. If you'd rather go into Nearpod and type the join code, that's fine as well. This activity is just going to be matching to see which term on the number trajectory matches with which definition. It is okay if some of these terms are completely unfamiliar to you. The terms are the one-word ones. We have subitizing number conservation, one-to-one correspondence, comparison, cardinality, hierarchical inclusion, and counting. And the other 7 cards are the definitions. And your goal right now is to try to just match the name on the trajectory to what the definition is. Again, just an activator. It's okay if they're not familiar to you. Just do the best you can. I'm going to give about a minute and I'll keep my eye on the data to see when we're about ready to move on. All right, let's take about 30 more seconds. You can keep working towards it. I see some people have finished. If you have finished, start thinking about which one you think might come first on the trajectory, because it is a true progression of skills, and there is one that typically develops before others. Okay, I'm noticing most people have finished, but keep working if you're not, that's totally fine, but I'm going to start reviewing. And I know the answers popped up for you, but I just want to talk through them a little bit more. And then we'll look at which one maybe came first. So I'm just going to go in the order they appear on the screen. Subitizing may be something you're familiar with if you've taught kindergarten now or in the past, but other than that, it may be a new word to you. Subitizing is when you are able to just be able to tell how many there are with a quantity of 5 or less. So that's this one. And the best example I can give you is a dice, like a die in a game. So when you roll the die, you don't count 1, 2, 3. You know that the 3 dots in a diagonal formation is 3. You just know it. So that's what subitizing is. You just kind of know it. Number conservation is knowing that you always have, that you have the number you have. If you don't add any more or take any away, it remains that number. So if I have 5 cubes and I move them to the 4 corners of the page and keep 1 in the middle, I still have 5 because I didn't add any, I didn't take any away. It's just going to stay 5. That's number conservation. So that one, let's see. This one. And that one is part whole also. So knowing that if I have 2 and 3 more, that's 5, 1 and 4 more, that's also 5. It's still 5. The next one is one-to-one correspondence. And that's being able to match up a number name to an item one at a time. So that's connecting one number with one object. So if you have a line of teddy bears and you count them by pointing 1, 2, 3, 4, that is one-to-one correspondence, that each time you point to a new object, you progress to the next number in the counting sequence. Comparison is comparing two quantities. It does not have to mean by counting the number in each and saying this is greater than. And comparison can include using greater than, less than symbols and understanding, but it can also just mean knowing that that pile has more things. The next word is cardinality. Cardinality is how many are in the set. So if I have just counted 5 teddy bears and I say, how many are there? I can respond 5 without needing to recount. I know how many are there. Hierarchical inclusion is likely a new term no matter what you teach, because that's not something we typically use with students. But this is when numbers are inside of other numbers. So if I have 10 cubes, I must also have 7 cubes. So a student understanding that if I have 10, I also must have 9. I must have 8. I must have 7, because all of those numbers are less than the number that I have. So I have to have that much. That's hierarchical inclusion. And then lastly, counting is the memorized sequence of numbers that we say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on. That's the rote procedure of counting. So those are the parts of the number trajectory. Now I'm going to have you try to put them in order from what comes first, what develops first, to what develops last. So this is a fill in the blanks activity. And you have a little bit of a hint, because I know number 4 has 4 blanks and 6 and 7 have 2 each, but I couldn't make it work otherwise. So there's your hint. But try to start with what you think kids would develop first and work your way down towards what they would develop last. I'm going to be quiet again and let you work in the Nearpod for another minute or so. All right, I see most people are working their way towards finishing, so another 30 seconds or so, and then I will reveal the answer if you haven't gotten there yet. Okay, I'm gonna show on the Zoom screen the answer. So if you're still persisting and you want to keep trying, go for it. Just don't click on the Zoom until you're ready. And then I am going to move to the next part, which will go through each part. So at that point, you'll know. So this on your screen is what the number trajectory has from beginning to end. I struggled with this when I first saw it. So if you're struggling with it as well, that's okay. And you may disagree just right off the bat. That's okay too. This number trajectory, which I will show you, is the work of 4 mathematicians. And they worked together to kind of figure out early numeracy skills and how they developed in students. And this is what they felt students, and when I say student, I mean starting from birth. So as a child, what they developed first towards what developed last. And we have to acknowledge for some kids, when they come into kindergarten, they've got all this. They have all 7 of these, and they of course need work expanding on their knowledge, but they can do a portion of all 7 of these skills. And we also have to acknowledge that we have students who come in and they don't have any of these things, and they may never have been directly taught them or really even pointed out to them. So maybe they can do bits and pieces of them, but they don't really have proficiency with them because they haven't practiced to that extent. So that means coming into kindergarten, we've got kids ranging from got this to not at all. And all 7 of these skills are within kindergarten module 1, but they are not explicitly taught for long periods of time because most of kindergarten and 1st and 2nd grade end up at number 7, the number conservation. That's where we end up kind of living. And that is the part whole relationship. And as you know, as soon as I call that part whole, you know, you think all those number bonds, right? If you're a kindergarten teacher, there's a lot of number bonds that you work through. I believe it's module 4. And then continuing all the way up through Eureka Math, including in 6th grade, you know, if they're in Math 5-6, they still use number bonds for decimals and fractions. So number conservation ends up being the part where we live for a really long time. And the other ones are maybe touched upon, but they're not as explicitly taught. That's where the gaps come in. So if you're a 1st, 2nd grade teacher, even kindergarten or beyond, you may have kids who don't have some of these skills, and that's what's impacting their number sense because they don't actually have an understanding of numbers at all these levels. We are going to look at a video that's going to introduce it to you before I show you the actual like PDF of the number trajectory, which does exist, and I will share it with you. But Graham Fletcher, his name is right here. And I introduced myself saying I'm a math person. That's my jam. I'm definitely, I geek out a little over Graham Fletcher. I love him and I would fangirl if I ever had to meet him, but he knows his math, and the way he explains it is very relatable and understandable. And so I'm going to let him in this 7-minute video show you the progression and just pay close attention, especially if you're someone who kind of doesn't think that subitizing comes first. Pay attention to, as he's introducing it, what he shows each piece to be, and then I think it will help make sense for why they develop in this order. And I do want to again remind you, I'm talking at birth. So, you know, if you're 2 years old, that's 3 years old, some of these numeracy skills will begin to develop. I am going to mute myself, but the video is shared. If anyone's, the sound is shared. If anyone's is lagging, you might want to try turning off your camera. And if it continues to lag, please let me know in the chat and I can turn off my camera. Sometimes that helps as well.
Before we ever get to addition and subtraction, and long before we tackle fractions and decimals, there's so much understanding that needs to take place. So here I'll try to explain the progression of early number and counting. Well, before students come to us in kindergarten, they begin to see what numbers look like. I mean, literally. Check out these dice. Students know that there's 4, 2, 3, and 5, but they don't know that quantity. They're just simply calling out number names and matching them to what the things look like. They know that we have 3, 3, 5, and 4 on the yellow card. What they're doing is matching a number name to a visual pattern. This is a really big piece, but a lot of kids are able to do this before they come to us in kindergarten. This ability to recognize quantity without counting one-to-one is called subitizing. Some say sub, some say su. I just say it's magic. But here, if we were to show the number 4, a student might say 4. Yes, they know the number name, but if you ask them to prove it, they might count them 1, 3, 9, 7. This is a perceptual subitizer. They cannot explain why it's 4. I think most of us are familiar with the conceptual subitizer that would say 4 because there's 2 and 2 more. In this early trajectory, we're talking about a perceptual subitizer. So as students are working on this idea of subitizing, they're simultaneously building their understanding of more and less. Let's take these 2 hands, for example. If we were to put some candy in each hand, and then we were to ask a student, which one has more? I think most students are going to say the one on the right has more. And they're able to recognize this because they can visually see and compare the difference. They can't tell you exactly how many more, but that visual representation of more, well, that ties back to what they're doing with subitizing. The students don't need to count to compare the quantities. If we were to take some candies from the right hand, put them in the left hand to where they're equal or almost the same, now we have a need to count. So when students come to us in kindergarten, we now know that they have this idea of subitizing and more or less that they've been working on. So from there, we introduce rote counting. Rote counting, well, it's kind of like this. As students are learning the alphabet, they might say LMNOP and have no idea that there's actually letters embedded in there. Rote counting, same thing. Students are just working on that count sequence, the reciting of names. So an example of that would be as if we asked a student to count from 1 to 6. They might say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. We said stop at 6, but you know what? They can't. They have no idea where 6 is in that count sequence. Well, in kindergarten, students should be working on that count sequence from 0 to 100, forwards and backwards. I think most students in kindergarten have had exposure to a hundreds chart or a 99 chart. But what about this one on the right? When the value increases, the numbers on the chart rise up. Now when we count up from 0, we don't go down, we actually go up. That might make more sense to kids. Something to think about. So as students are working on this idea of rote counting, we begin to introduce this idea of one-to-one correspondence. And to be honest, one-to-one correspondence, it's much more than simply tagging numbers to objects. Here's an example. If we ask a student to count 8 and place them in the bowl from a set, and they're able to do that, they're a producer of counting. They're able to do that one-to-one tagging to 8. Now, if you ask them how many were in the bowl, they don't know. They'd have to go back and recount them all over. A student that we'd ask how many didn't make it inside the bowl, well, they're a counter. They can count a finite set of a quantity. So for instance, there was 4 that couldn't make it. So we want to make sure that students are both counters and producers. And one way we can do that is by building this understanding of tagging, but not always with numbers. So here we have 6 bears and we want to match each bear to a green present. This idea that's happening in one-to-one correspondence, it's really, really big, and we need to make sure that we devote enough time for our students to develop this understanding. So as students are working on rote counting and one-to-one correspondence, cardinality gradually makes its way into the conversation. What cardinality is when students are counting out a set of objects, the last number in that count sequence describes the quantity in the set. Students might count this pattern here of these pennies, but they might double count some. So now they use a counting strategy where they line them up and count from 1 to 8, and they know that they said 8 last, so that there's 8 in the count sequence. This was an example of a counter with the pennies, and on the bottom here with the rec, we have a producer of 8, and they're able to tell you that it's 8 because of the last number. We then move on to hierarchical inclusion. Yeah, it's a really big word, but all that it means is that students understand that numbers are nested inside other numbers. So if we take that penny, for example, students would know that if you had 8 pennies, you must have 7 pennies. That numbers are nested inside the numbers. So if we ask students to put 7 inside this circle, do they need to count out 7 pennies, or do they just remove 1 and drag the set into the circle? The same idea with the rec. Do students count out 7, or do they just know to remove 1 because 7 is nested within the 8? And at the final part of this progression of early numbering counting comes number conservation. The big idea here is that students understand that there's a decomposition of number. We might ask, are they the same? Students would say, yeah, we have the same number. But if we stretch out the blue row and ask which one has more, students might say the blue. This is at the heart of number conservation. It's about decomposition, that numbers can be broken apart, and that numbers, the whole, is made up from parts. So at the beginning, we talked about a perceptual subitizer. Well, here we have 3 sets of 4. Well, when students get to this piece in the number sense trajectory, they understand that 4 is made up from parts. So now when we show students these dots and we show them these yellow cards, they're able to see that 4 just isn't a name, it describes the parts of a whole. Now we're getting to that conceptual subitizing. There's a whole lot happening here. One thing to remember, the turtle won the race. Thanks for watching.
So we're going to go through the number trajectory now, looking at a PDF of it so you could see it in print. But hopefully that helped anchor some understanding as to why we start with subitizing and work from there, because it really is something that can develop when they're a child. So the beginning of the number trajectory, and we can look at this horizontally as well as vertically. We're going to start with the horizontally first. So subitizing is at the beginning of this trajectory. And that was hard for me too in the beginning. But the best example I can think of for little kids at that age is when you say to someone, oh, like a toddler, how old are you? And they might do this and hold up 2 fingers, or do this and hold up 3 fingers. And they don't really know what that means. And sometimes they're not even able to say, like, you know, to articulate it, or they might say, I'm 3, and they just hold up 3 fingers, but they couldn't yet say to you 1, 2, 3 and count it. They just know that this many fingers is how old they are, and that means 3. So it's just knowing a pattern of something and being able to say what number it is without necessarily knowing how you got there. And it's because someone taught you that. It's not necessarily something that they're gaining through counting. And you'll notice it says 5 or less. That is the perceptual subitizing. So it's sort of the P, perceptual. The other one he said is conceptual, and you can remember because of concepts. And that's when you're using math concepts to break apart the pattern that you see and kind of add to figure out what you have. Perceptual is what we're starting with, and it's just knowing, oh, that's 3. The next piece of the number trajectory is the comparison. He showed the candy. I think if you had, you know, most toddlers and you showed them 2 handfuls of candy, they'd say, which one do you want? They'd pick the one with the most. And you might say, why? And they say, because it's more. Same with a piece of cake. Like, they're going to know the size of what's bigger and know that they prefer that. When it's something attractive like candy or cake. So that they have that comparison skill, then they can look at 2 things and evaluate which one is more and they want more, but they can't necessarily count each hand and know exactly how much more they're getting. That can still develop at a very young age. The next one is counting, and that's that memorized sequence, the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And you may have seen this in your own kids or in nieces or nephews or perhaps your students, where they just string together a memorized set of numbers without necessarily knowing what they mean. This is something that is worked on directly in kindergarten in order to get to 100, because it's common for kids to have that memorized sequence up to 10, possibly beyond. But, you know, kindergarten explicitly works on up to 100. So you're reviewing how that pattern continues to repeat itself, you know, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 in the ones place, and then you go back. That has to be worked on forward and back. And the example he showed with the hundreds chart, I think, is excellent. I created a different hundreds chart this year because we often build in first grade, you build your 10s going up, right? Because it's like you build your 10 stick with your dots, and then you make the quick 10 by just slashing through, and that goes vertically. So we did a bottoms up hundreds chart. So like in the video, he showed that the 0 was on the bottom and the 100 was at the top. That's opposite of what we usually see. We usually see the 1, I said 0, I'm sorry, I meant 1. We usually see the 1 at the top of a hundreds chart and the 100 at the bottom. But that shows that as you go down, the number gets bigger. When in reality, adding on, going up makes the number get bigger, right? So starting with 1 in the bottom of a hundreds chart and working your way up would make more conceptual sense to students because we're building up. So we created a hundreds chart that the first column, 1 is at the bottom, 10 is at the top. And then the second column, 11 is at the bottom and 20 is at the top. So that you're basically building 10 sticks from 1 all the way to 100, which is on the right-hand side at the top. That's part of counting and recognizing the pattern, but it's a different way to look at counting. It's not just saying it out loud, but it is still within counting. One-to-one correspondence, if you're like me, you always probably thought of that as just pointing and counting, right? So if you have 5 teddy bears in a row, you count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And each time you count to a new teddy bear, you say the next number in the sequence. And that is part of one-to-one correspondence. It's the counter. But what we don't give kids enough experience with is the producer or the matching. So when we ask them to count out a sequence and create that group, not just count what's in the group, but create a group, that's the producer. And when we ask them to match with something, that's the matcher. And all those are ways to provide kids with that one-to-one correspondence practice. Cardinality is just knowing how many you have after you have counted. There are 3 levels of counting. In kindergarten, it is likely that your kids are counting all. So every time you give them a number, they count, or a quantity of something, they count all of them. That's level 1 of counting all. And cardinality would be at the end, they can tell you how many they have. The next level of counting is counting on, and that's more common when you get to 1st grade, right? And we tell them, okay, put that number in your head, and then you add on. So if you have 3 plus 4, I put 3 in my head, and then I have 4, 5, 6, 7. I add 4 more. I ended at 7. That's what I have. Cardinality is that I'm at 7. But that's level 2 of counting, where you put a number in your head, you add on. Level 3 of counting is the most advanced and what we want all kids to get to, ideally by the end of 1st grade, but definitely by 2nd grade. And that is making an easier problem. It's hard to tell you that with 3 plus 4. So I'm going to go to a bit more sophisticated example. But, you know, if I had 17 plus 6, that would be asking kids to take, you know, say, okay, well, I know 17 and 3 more is 20. So I'm going to break my 6 into 3 and 3 because one of those 3s goes with the 17 and that's 20. So then I have 23. That's the next level of counting where you don't need to put 17 in your head and use 6 fingers, but instead you can manipulate the numbers to make an easier problem. And that's what we want to get kids to, that level 3. That's all wrapped up under cardinality because it's still giving the end answer. So those are all skills you can work on within cardinality. Hierarchical inclusion, it's a new term to you most likely, but you know, if you have $10, can I buy this $4 item? Yes, you can, because if you have 10, you must have 4. That's hierarchical inclusion. So it's just having that sense of knowing that if I have a number, I also have all the numbers less than that. And then lastly is that number conservation. And this is where you live most of the time. This is the part whole, and it's number bonds. And it's knowing that no matter how I rearrange those 5 items, I still have 5 items. That's number conservation. That's looking horizontally. But if you notice, the shading vertically also matches up. So subitizing and comparison are both spatial relationships or seeing a pattern and knowing what you have skills. So that's the first part, is you're not using numbers. You're just seeing spatially what you have. Then you progress to the counting. And as he said in the video, when you want to know exactly how much more candy you have, that's when you need to count. So then you move to this counting stage. And this is where kindergarten spends the first marking period. And it's where you learn 1 and 2 more or less, and you know how to get to the next number. And then lastly, but again, still within kindergarten, we're getting to this hierarchical inclusion number conservation. And it says here, understanding anchors. Another word you might have heard for that is a benchmark number. So 5 is a common benchmark number. So is 10. But if you're working with a 10 frame in kindergarten, they do, you know, when you start to explore the numbers 6, 7, and 8, you're referring to them as 5 and 1 more, 5 and 2 more, 5 and 3 more, right? Looking at that 10 frame, those are the anchors. We're anchoring to 5, and that is hierarchical inclusion. If I have 6, 7, or 8, 5 is a part of it and some more. And I already spoke about part whole. So that is the number trajectory in full. These 4 mathematicians, Clements, Sarama, Van de Waal, and Lovin, collaborated to make this number sense trajectory. Graham Fletcher was the one in the video explaining it and showing it on that whiteboard, but these are the 4 who came up with this number trajectory as how most kids learn to count. To have numeracy. We're going to do a quick little word splash just to see where you are. I'm going to put a link in the chat, and this link is to a word cloud. And it should allow you to type in a one word that you feel that your kids in your class right now might need the most. I want to acknowledge every kid in your class will need different things, right? So some kids might be good with all of this. Some kids might need a whole lot of it. So just think of the vast majority of your class and what you think most of them might struggle with. It should look like this when you click the link. And if it's not letting you click, if you go to Live Cloud Online, this is the join code KC32. You'll have to type your name, but then once you join, it'll ask you to type a word. So, or 2 words. So like I might think, okay, my kids are struggling the most with counting because maybe they can't get past 10. And then you just click send and our word cloud will develop as people enter theirs. So I'll just give like 30 seconds for some ideas to get in there. If for some reason your word cloud is not working, please just drop it in the chat. That's fine too. Very flexible. And I know it looks like it's not changing. So far, 5 people have said counting. So it's just getting bigger and bigger because more people, everyone so far has said the same one. All right, I'm going to enter. I have somebody else's in the chat. So I'm going to enter that for them. All right, so now you see the number conservation, comparison of numbers, counting, another conservation. Yep, more counting in the chat. So it seems that in this group, counting is definitely one of the big ones. In the last group I had, subitizing was also a big one, that while they may not have had a chance to collect data on if kids actually know this or not, it seems like something that their kids have struggled with. So feel free to keep popping those in. But how do you know what your kids struggle with, right? This is just your gut. So for data collection, this is not something I would necessarily recommend doing with your whole class. But that being said, I do have a quick observational checklist that you could use with your whole class if you choose to. And I acknowledge this is extra. And we all know we barely have time for what we do as it is, right? So I would never ask you to do extra. But if you think it could be valid for your class and maybe you're struggling with number sense, this might be something you want to do. So this resource that I'm showing would be like for your whole class. You'd type the kids' names. You would note maybe what level of counting they're on. Do they always have to count from 1 or can they count on? Because that tells you the type of learner or the type of counter that they are at. And then the number trajectory. Are they able to, like a quick check? Are they able to do this? You wouldn't have a chance to observe all of these every day. But every now and again, if this is on a clipboard, you can maybe return to it and do a quick check, right? So this would be for your whole class if you want some quick data. Just, where are we at? Likely, you'll have a few kids who struggle with many things, okay? But that's like your small group. So if you have those few kids, that's when you might want a deeper interview with students where you're like, ooh, okay, we are struggling here. I need to dig deeper. This is a numbers trajectory interview. I'm going to put this one in the chat now. And this one would be one-on-one with the student. And I acknowledge, again, takes time, right? Not at all disagreeing. So this, you'd have to find time for this. But this would give you in the prompt what to do with the child to see, do they know, can they subitize perceptually? Do they have to count 1, 2, 3, 4, so, and if they do, they're not really subitizing. And it does need to be 5 dots or less. Otherwise, they're definitely going to count. You might want to try a more familiar thing like a die, because the dice is something many kids have seen, whereas the other arrangements they might not have. But it'll talk you through all the different prompts of what you can do with the child to just kind of note what are they doing. You'll notice the counting goes 1 to 30 because you want to go over the decade numbers. If you're in kindergarten, I think that's perfectly appropriate. If you're in first grade, you may want to switch it up a little bit and have them count from like 21 to 40. Just kind of switch it up to see a higher number. And if you're in second grade, same, you may want to go up a little bit because in second grade, they should be able to count above 100. So you may want to kind of make it more rigorous depending on your grade level. But that would be a way just to get additional data on your students who you feel are struggling with number sense. Then you have to take the data and analyze it, right? So is there something that most of your class is struggling with? Maybe they didn't really get any practice with subitizing because you're a second grade teacher and their kindergarten year was completely virtual. And so that was something that just wasn't done. So then you would maybe hone your fluency activities to include subitizing. The Eureka lessons are awesome, but the fluencies are created based on what they anticipate your kids will need. You are allowed to change them because you know your kids very well. The curriculum writers didn't. So if you have a need in your class where they are all struggling or most are struggling with subitizing or counting, or, and that's the happy counting sequence, right? Or maybe they're rock stars at counting, but they're really struggling with counting on, or they, the one-to-one correspondence isn't working well. You can create fluencies that will meet those needs. You do not need to stick with exactly what's in the book if you are recognizing some gaps in their learning, because if they don't have all these things in the number trajectory, they will not have number sense later on. You can explore during transitions, like, walking in the hallway with subitizing cards or counting as they line up, just to have them hear the sequence in their head. There are things you can add in that are just part of your day that aren't math per se, the math time. If you have a small group or maybe a student with an intense gap, that's when you want to explore, perhaps with your math content coach, or if you have a paraeducator in the room, is there somebody who can help meet with these kids for 5 minutes a day, 8 to 10 minutes a day. It can be during the fluency and they do a different fluency. It can be during the problem set. It can be not during math times. There's this final resource for you that is, and this is just my title because I made it for my first grade team, but all of the activities within this document, once it loads, these are from the Eureka Equip assessments, where if they struggle with something, they have the supporting content. These are the supporting content. So this is all Eureka, but they could use this to go over subitizing or to go over comparison. There are some additional resources linked within, like additional dot cards. So then you can, I'm just going to change it to view access before I share. But then you guys can use those just for additional dot cards. So this is the para folder. And I called it the para folder because at my school, paras are doing this. You can do this too. And these can be things that you use for fluency. So your instructional shifts are essentially changing up the Eureka lesson, not the whole lesson, but the fluency part is a beautiful 10-minute part of your day where you can meet your kids' needs. So if you recognize the number trajectory is a need they have, any part of that, then you can meet that need by changing your fluencies. And of course, you can sprinkle it in any way throughout the day that works for you, but I'm pushing fluency because I just know that that's a time where you're going through 2 or 3 activities quickly to address needs. And once you find the needs, that's what you can do. In closing, there is an evaluation that I'll share in a minute, but in closing, this quote resonated with me. The best way to develop fluency with numbers is to develop number sense by working with numbers in different ways, not blindly memorize. And all those 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th grade teachers who say they just don't have number sense, it's because they're lacking this stuff when they're young. So kindergarten, 1st grade, research has shown kids who struggle in K1 will continue to struggle unless they fill in these gaps in the number trajectory. So this is really important at the primary grade level to hit these skills. And while they are, like I said, explicitly taught in the Eureka curriculum in kindergarten module 1, we don't necessarily see them after there. So you may need to gap fill and to do that with your children. I'm going to stop screen sharing in a second, but I am going to share in the chat the evaluation. We are asking, if you don't mind, that you fill it in twice. And I know that seems like extra work, so my apologies in advance. But the evaluation can be filled out once just for me for this number trajectory session, and then a second time for PLCamp as a whole, like what did you think of today? I do acknowledge we had issues with the Zoom links in the beginning. So thank you so much for showing up and being here, because I know that you had to pivot from what we originally had said was our Zoom link. So much appreciation for that. And then a final plug for Graham Fletcher, because I do love him. I showed you the number trajectory video. He also has videos on the addition, subtraction, progression, the multiplication and division progression for your upper grades teachers, and on fractions. So it's just a very understandable way to see how kids' skills develop. If you want to check out his website, he has that, as well as something called 3-act tasks that are excellent for enrichment or just for engagement to switch it up a little bit as an application problem in your class. At this time, my portion is done, but if anyone has any questions and would rather come off mute, please feel free to do so or drop it in the chat. But once you've grabbed the evaluation link, you're welcome to exit. And thank you so much for coming. I appreciate you being here. Thank you.